Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker. It's a scientific fact that both an EMP and solar storm can take down our nation's electrical grid, which could take years to restore. Tests have shown many vehicles will no longer run, all internet and phone communications will be severely disrupted, and all banking and credit card processing will just stop. Finally, a book that not only explains how this is possible in a very easy to understand presentation, but also dispels all the EMP myths and hype circulating the internet has come into our possession. Not only will the ABCs of EMP, the name of the book, help you understand the threat, but it also includes a lot of common sense ways to be better prepared. What's true? What's hype? What will an EMP actually do, and what can it not do? The answers can be found inside this book. Jeffrey Yago is a licensed engineering NABCEP certified solar professional and a certified energy professional with more than 40 years of professional experience working in the energy and emergency power field. He's a regular contributor to Backwoods Home Magazine and has contributed to Home Power Magazine and Mother Earth News. He's committed to energy independence and lives outside of Richmond, Virginia. Joining us now to share his follow-up book to Lights On is the author of The ABCs of EMP, a practical guide to both understanding and surviving an EMP, is Jeff Yago. Jeff, welcome back to Revealing the Truth.
Good afternoon. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Well, we're glad to have you back. We learned a lot from Lights On, which was the book that you published about 3 or 4 years ago that kind of took us into understanding our grid and what our vulnerabilities are. But during that same time and for a number of years, the concept of an EMP, a explosion above the atmosphere, a nuclear explosion that would render an electromagnetic pulse or force that would render electrical devices inoperable. It's been talked about in a lot of ways, but I'm not really sure that anybody understands why it's something you need to understand and how it fits into what's going on around the world, which helps make sense of why there is a part of the community that is concerned when China puts a new satellite into orbit or Iran puts a satellite into orbit. They certainly don't have the quest for space to look for scientific exploration. They're looking for spy technology, and each one of these new satellites is being equipped with armament which would not drop a nuclear weapon onto a city like New York or to Chicago, but would explode in the atmosphere, and it has a major impact that can be quantified. So maybe you can kind of take us into an understanding of this concept of what is an EMP, why does it matter, is America really vulnerable, more vulnerable, less vulnerable, is this going to be the warfare of choice in what we're looking at as we look biblically to many references to what happens to societies and to people and world government and currencies, and how it is that people could fall under a one world government or one world currency. If you had systems disabled, then you would be operating under a unified system. So help us walk us through an understanding of this fundamental concept of what is an EMP and why does it matter?
All right. Well, it's a big question, of course. That's what the book was all about. I'll try to put it together in a short sentence, if I can. When I'm saying nuclear device, I know most of the listeners are thinking of the movies where the a nuclear bomb goes off at ground level, and you see the trees and the houses blowing away, and there's a big mushroom cloud over in the horizon, and this fireball that scorches or burns everything. That is not what we're talking about. No, I want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. What we're talking about is a small nuclear device, and it has to be detonated above our ionosphere, and that's a protective layer around the Earth. It's been there. It's about starts about 200 miles up, and it expands and contracts every day depending on the amount of outer space energy it absorbs. So the Earth is constantly being bombarded by, X-rays, gamma rays, uh, ultraviolet energy from the sun. There's all these energies that are impacting the Earth, and the ionosphere is kind of a buffer zone, and
Okay,
it
so
protects the
so
Earth.
so let me kind of get some clarification here. So we have the Earth, and we have what we call atmosphere, and the atmosphere is kind of where we live in this space of where our weather systems take place, the O2 levels, CO2 levels, carbon, the gases, those kind of things that impact our daily life. That's in the atmosphere, and that atmosphere is from the surface of the Earth extending how far up to where we see a definitive break and transition into the ionosphere.
Well, it's probably, I guess your transition would be about 150 miles up. But as we get into 200-mile up range and higher, that's what we call the ionosphere. And what happens is the air molecules in our atmosphere that you just mentioned, some of them rise up higher. They gradually go higher and higher and higher. And when they get at this extremely high elevation, um, they get bombarded by this energy, and it converts them into ions. They lose an electron, and an air molecule, uh, which has a neutral charge, basically gets ionized or gets charged, and it's basic. Think of it as a cloud surrounding the Earth, and it is a protective layer. And what happens with the EMP device? It wants to disturb that area. It wants to be up into that upper ionosphere area, because when it's detonated, this massive amount of gamma rays and X-rays that are given off from the nuclear device, they bombard this ionosphere, and it instantly releases all these electrons. I'm trying to avoid being in a physics class here, but the bottom line is it has to interact with the ionosphere in order to create this, what we call an electromagnetic pulse, or EMP. And that is this massive wave that's going to come down and spread out from this point of impact uh, into our regular atmosphere, and it's line of sight. So at 200 miles up, its line of sight is almost coast to coast of the United States. So it doesn't come straight down.
Okay,
This
so
this
I'm on an airplane, and when I'm traveling on an airplane, I'm traveling in the ionosphere.
No, you're
Uh,
traveling below it. You're traveling within maybe 5 miles up in the atmosphere.
so when I'm traveling on a intercontinental plane, I'm only at an elevation of 25,000 feet.
Correct. You're probably around 5 miles up. Um, you'd have to go much higher to, you know, I think the space shuttle is around maybe in the 300 to 400 mile up range. That might help give us a little. I mean, the International Space Station, not the shuttle, but the International Space Station, I think is around 350, 400 miles up.
Okay.
So you, it has to be detonated up at that higher elevation. And the point of it is, at that elevation, there is no sound, there's no atmosphere. So we won't hear it. and there is no mushroom cloud because there's nothing for it to interact with. So we're not going to see it, we're not going to hear it, and we're not going to know at first it even went off. Now, of course, the military would know because we have satellites and sensors and devices that would indicate this. But as far as Joe Public, we wouldn't know immediately, other than the fact if we were, say, driving down the interstate in a car, the odds are high that all the vehicles around us are going to stop. If we're using electrical appliances, it's certainly going to experience a power outage. But a lot of us experience power outages all the time, so we're not going to know at first what caused it. It's just going to be, oh, well, the electricity's off again. So we'll also lose communications because EMP, this energy wave affects radio, television, microwave transmissions, phones, all your data transmissions. So you suddenly have not only lost your electricity, but when you go to pick up your cell phone to call a neighbor or a relative to see if their power's off, you're going to find out that your phone is not working either.
Okay.
And of course, that also means banking, everything.
Right. So here we have something in the ionosphere that's going to, will it deploy a device, or will the device be, I'm thinking of a ray, because
Okay.
if
I see what you're saying. It's not a gun or it's
right.
not like a missile. It's just the explosion itself causes the EMP.
Okay, so will that consume so let's say we're a satellite, and this device is mounted on that satellite, and it is set to detonate. Okay, does it detonate in place, and it has a as you say, line of sight. So whatever, and we've seen the Google map pictures. We've seen what's and we've seen the shuttle in orbit, and we can see what they can see. And they can't see the whole Earth. They can only see a particular section, a continent, a particular area. But will this explosion, will this consume whatever is holding it, whatever is housing it? Will it consume it? Or is this a charge which is so directed that it will be deployed outward without any, could I have multiple devices contained and just deploy one of them and have a reserve?
No, it's going to consume whatever it is. In other words, if you would take a normal nuclear device, as we have been testing, underground tests and things, if you took that same device and just put it in a balloon or something that could get it high enough up in the air and detonated it, that would be causing the EMP. It's the nuclear explosion interacting with the ionosphere is what makes the pulse. That same nuclear device at ground level would not make an EMP because there's no ionosphere for it to interact with. Now, one caveat, because you kind of hit on something, there is development to make EMP-generated weapons that amplify the effect. In other words, it will still be consumed, but there are ways to take a small nuclear explosion within a device, and that device, although it gets consumed, it has there's ways to create a much more powerful pulse. So, but of course, any satellite, anything in line of sight of this thing is going to be consumed by it.
In reality, aren't things like lightning or electrostatic discharge or some other naturally occurring events, aren't they in themselves kind of an EMP? Like we have a lightning storm, and that is an electrical discharge, an electromagnetic magnetic pulse. We know that the electrons are charged. They're active, and they have a range of impact which is much greater than the bandwidth of a single lightning bolt. There's an area of effect. Is that kind of a naturally occurring in atmosphere electromagnetic pulse? And we know that sometimes it takes a generator out. It takes a generating station out, and we have blackouts, so we have problems from it. Is that kind of a mini version?
I think that's a good description of a mini version of an EMP. If we, again, I don't want to get into too much of the physics today because it's not really necessary to understand this at a basic level. But we talk about EMP as if it's one thing, and you're right in referencing lightning as a broader frequency range. But EMP is basically consists of three parts, not one part. It's not one thing. It's three things that happen almost simultaneously, and we call them E1, E2, and E3. It's just naming for these different phases of an EMP detonation or EMP wave. E1 is the initial impact of this wave, the shock wave. E1 is very, very high frequency radio waves, or we're talking about up in gigahertz range, millions of cycles a second, but very, very high frequency and very fast. The timing of the initial phase is in nanoseconds. We're dividing up 1 second into millions of tiny parts. So that first E1 guy, it's going to damage more of the electronics, more of the microchips, anything that has electronics associated with it. That gets zapped by the E1, I guess you could say that way.
Okay, now does that electronic need to be turned on? The example is if I'm driving down the road in my car, and my car has tons of computer technology, electronics in it, and an EMP strikes, the belief is it will disable the electrical connections and make my car inoperable. But if my car is parked and there is no action other than the battery feeding its trickle charge to keep the clock active and whatever minor minor discharge that there is, will that disable a non-operating electronic device?
Whether it's I hope we have a chance to talk about vehicles in a minute, but whether an electronic device is on or off, it can still be impacted and damaged by the EMP, because what happens is this very fast E1 phase of high frequency will penetrate through walls and anything but solid metal. And so that means anything with enough length of wire will serve as an antenna and basically absorb this energy wave, and that will carry it into the electronics. So it doesn't matter if it's turned on or not. For example, a radio, let's say we have a desktop radio with a 6-foot extension of electric cord on the end. If it was plugged in, it's going to be damaged by E3, which we're going to talk about in a minute, and that is the high voltage surge that's going to come in on the power line. But the E1 phase is going to come in basically into the radio, whether it's plugged in, not plugged in. It's just going to absorb this, and it's going to damage the electronics in there. Now the E2 part is slightly behind E1 by nanoseconds, but slightly behind it, and it's much slower, and it's lower frequencies. and its effect is almost exactly what you described with lightning. And yes, things like lightning surge protectors can help block that lower frequency, slower E2 phase. Um, then E3 is much slower. It comes along a couple of seconds later and can last minutes. And the E3 is more of a magnetic wave rather than like a radio wave. And what it does is it disturbs the lines of magnetic force around the Earth. So a simple way to think about this is if you, maybe in junior high, you had a teacher that moved a wire or a magnet back and forth across a wire, and you could see a little voltage generated on a meter. Well, think of thousands of miles of electric lines and phone lines across the surface of the Earth. When the E3 comes along, it's actually moving the magnetic lines of the Earth side to side, and that's like waving a gigantic magnet across these power lines, and that creates the millions of volts and the thousands of amps of current that come down the wires and into the substations and the transformers, and that's where we lose the grid. So it's the E3 part that's going to basically take out our power grid, but it's going to be the E1 that's going to take out anything with microelectronics in it. So it just, again, all this happens in seconds, but they are still totally different frequencies, different speeds, and they each have their own effects, and they each have different ways to block them. And you mentioned solar storms a minute ago. Solar storm effects are almost identical to the E3. So not the E1, 2, but solar storm, a coronal mass ejection, anything from the sun, its effects on the electric grid is almost identical to the E3 part of a EMP.
You know, when we talked about Lights On, which was your first book, which was very well written, very important, we talked about the vulnerability and how many times the grid has been affected and brought down. We talked about Denver, and these things aren't publicized. When you think about a satellite mounted weapon and it having line of sight, how how accurate, how targeted, what are the control mechanism? Once it's released, it's released. It's going to go where it's going to go. Is it capable of being directed like a laser, or is it more of a swath that it establishes based on the power, which is what's behind it, what the propellant is?
Well, a true EMP nuclear weapon going off, it's going to be more of the broad spread out from that point, blow and sideways. However, we do have EMP weapons. We have devices much smaller, not to damage the whole country, but for example, we could destroy all the electronics and computers in a building. Those EMP devices do not use a nuclear explosion. They do use an explosion, but more on the terms of like dynamite or plastic explosives, and it would be more of what you would typically say could mount in the back of a pickup truck and park in a parking lot of a hospital or a government building. Those are directional. They will, you can aim them, but you're talking about a much smaller area affected. Typically, if there's an EMP weapon that's going to be used against us, the odds are it's going to be sent up from a container ship in the Gulf of Mexico. As soon as it's sent up, there's no direction. They're just going to point it straight up. It doesn't have to be a sophisticated missile or, Scud missile, things like that, that there's thousands of those available. And we know that there are missile platforms that can fit in a shipping container. So the biggest fear we have is one of these being mounted in a shipping container and an old derelict freighter gets moves into the Gulf of Mexico, close to our Texas coastline, shoots this thing straight up, which is going to take maybe all of 30 seconds to reach its altitude. In the meantime, they're scuttling the ship. Everybody's jumping in a fishing boat, and 5 minutes later, we're not going to know who did this, and that's the fear. If it was a nuclear device, a nuclear bomb attack, we would be tracking that missile for 15 minutes from China or North Korea or Russia or wherever it came from. We would know where it came from and would immediately retaliate. But we're talking about a weapon. We're not going to know who did it. We're not going to know where it came from. With about a 30-second flight time, we're not even going to be able to track it. So that's why it would make a great weapon for a country that wants to damage somebody like the United States without actually, it's not going to kill anybody. It's not going to kill any animals. It's not going to destroy any buildings. So a person would not, if they thought they could get away with it by not being able to track it, and they knew that it would not hurt people or buildings or infrastructure, it would be an ideal first strike weapon for a country that wants to take us over. And of course, if our electric is down, our grid's down, our communications are down, obviously what's going to happen is we're going to have 200 million people starve to death in the next 6 months. So obviously there's going to be a lot of people killed, but they're not going to be killed from this explosion. They're going to be killed from the fact that we can't create, distribute, grow food, refrigerate food. Drinking water is not going to be available. So that's where the damage is going to come. But as far as the country itself, you could just waltz in later and you've got all these millions of acres of great farmland that's available, and that's, and the resources that we have here that, some other country is just sitting there waiting for the opportunity. And that's obviously my concern, is how easy it would be to do this. And we have multiple countries that have EMP weapons. We know that. They just haven't used them yet.
So, do we have any record at all of EMP deployment in any instance, whether or not it be small scale, medium scale, or of any scale, that we can point to that gives us, other than theoretical analysis, actual data of the impact of what an EMP explosion? We do underground testing of nuclear weapons. Are we able to simulate, or are we able to deploy and actually measure the impact of an EMP on a hospital building or a building itself?
Absolutely. Now, during the 1950s, the United States and Russia did a lot of nuclear testing, and this above ground. These were tests. When I say above ground, they might mount a device in a bomb that's dropped from a plane, or even in a missile, but they wait till it gets down almost at ground level before it's detonated, not up in the ionosphere. So we have years of above ground testing by both the United States and Russia, and the effects of those nuclear tests. Now, none of those produced an EMP because they weren't high enough to interact with the ionosphere. But in 1962, we started doing testing up in the ionosphere, and the first one we did, the scientists were calculating there would be some type of an EMP pulse, but it had never been done before, so they didn't know if this was real or not, and that was the reason they did the test. And they did the test out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean on an uninhabited island. It was about 800 or so miles from Hawaii, and they had instrumentations to measure the effects of this test, but they were thinking in terms of 50 miles or 10 miles. When they actually set off the test up in the upper ionosphere. Um, it actually had damage as far away as Hawaii, which they didn't have instrumentation that far away, but they had the effects of it. So they know they were onto something, that there was some effects of this. And about 3 months later, Russia also did some some tests up in the ionosphere with nuclear devices, but their test was over Kazakhstan. So they were over inhabited land, not some uninhabited island. And yes, there was massive damage. They had 600 miles of underground power lines were destroyed, generators were destroyed, electronics were taken out. So, uh, unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess your viewpoint is right after that, all nuclear above ground testing was stopped. So the United States has much less actual testing information of the effects of EMP than Russia does. But we do know that China, Russia, Iran, North Korea all have war colleges where they teach their generals, and we have access to their books that they use. And every one of those countries use a discussion of EMP as a first strike weapon that is very much part of their war planning. So this is not something that may happen 50 years from now. This is very much feasible to happen sooner than later, especially think about kicking somebody when they're down. You know, the United States right now is not doing too well. And what if you had a weapon that would take out all of our communications, our banking, our infrastructure, but not hurt people? You know, that's my concern. It was a very we're vulnerable right now.
Now, are there ways to generate a non-nuclear electronic pulse? Uh, uh, Something that is more directed, or does all of this have to be an ionosphere nuclear explosion?
As I mentioned earlier, there are man-made EMP weapons that could fit in a truck, you know, pickup truck. Those typically use a small explosion, but more of what you would think of as a like plastic explosives or something. At a smaller level, um, you can make a EMP generating device that's directional. You could hold in your hand without using an explosive. It uses basically capacitors and you charging up to get this very high voltage, and then the capacitors are suddenly all discharged instantaneously, and that will generate the effects of an EMP without an explosion. But of course, you're talking about maybe the area of damage the size of a room, not something like a city or a state. It would so yes, there are different levels of doing this, but if you want to get a more a larger area impacted, it's as far as I know, most of the weapons that we have to do this require some type of a explosion, and a real EMP above the ionosphere would be a nuclear explosion.
So, as of we look right now on this date in the year 2020, we know that there are hundreds, maybe even thousands of satellites in orbit around the globe. Some friendly, others not so friendly. New satellites being launched all the time. We hear about them. China putting a satellite in space, Iran putting a satellite in space, other countries putting Israel putting satellites into space, knowing that they're not just up there for good looks and add to their nuclear, not their space programs. They're doing it as part of a spy offense and defense maneuvers so that they can see if they're reading heat signatures of various devices being deployed. If if you have an EMP deployed in outer space, do we have the technology? Because from my limited knowledge, the satellites that are being launched aren't looking at each other. They're looking at the countries where they believe that a weapon, conventional weapon, either nuclear or conventional, would be deployed from, and read the heat signature of what it is that's contained in that weapon, and then deploy the defense systems, whether they're laser or they're other systems, to incapacitate. And we know how limited our ability is to intercept intercontinental ballistic missiles. We've documented and said, it's a hit or miss kind of scenario. If one were coming our way, we might be able to hit it. We just don't have the technology. Israel has much more advanced technology, but they're not looking at the ICBMs. They're dealing with smaller Katyusha rockets and devices like that. As we examine this, would we know who deployed the EMP?
Well, first of all, you mentioned the satellites. There's about 1,000, just over 1,000 satellites in stationary orbit above the United States right now. And they're associated with such things as communications, GPS, military satellites, communication satellites. Of course, all those would be severely damaged if there was an EMP. But Iran has recently, put up their satellite, and North Korea has 2 satellites right now. All 3 of those satellites, and this is what's interesting, all 3 of those satellites are the only satellites up there that go around the Earth from the south to north orbit as it crosses the United States. In other words, it's coming up from the southern hemisphere, up across the United States, up over the North Pole and back around again every 90 minutes. We have no early warning radar pointed to the south in the United States. All of our early warning systems are all pointed north towards Russia. And our concern for years when this was all developed was that Russia would be sending satellites incoming over the North Pole, over Canada, over Alaska. So all of our early warning system that you're referencing about how would we know, we don't have anything pointed south. So I guess the first answer is we have nothing monitoring. So these, in particular, these 3 satellites, they would suddenly be they would go from being a satellite to being a weapon. We wouldn't know about it. And second of all, when I talked about nanoseconds of speed, all we were going to see is maybe a satellite go black. There would be instantly, they would be vaporized, or certainly they would lose all their ability to position themselves and just fall out of orbit. But all of this is going to be in a very instantaneous type of timing.
Okay, so here we have this situation where it sounds like it's a system of deployment of complete disruption to our power grid and to all of our communication systems. So anything which has a motor, anything that has capacitors, resistors, transmitters, transistors, wiring, all of that is going to be taken offline. How do you defend against that? How do you, is there a, to what depth below the surface does this have an impact? If my communication systems are underground through fiber optics, if my communication systems or my defense systems are underground, are they going to be penetrated to the fact where they're going to be reached by this? Is there a depth that it goes to, or is it meet its piece of resistance and that dissipates the pulse?
Well, of course, I have a big chunk of the book that deals with different ways that you can help mitigate or attenuate an EMP pulse to make it less destructive. As far as underground, above ground, that test I referenced from Russia and Kazakhstan in '62, that 600 miles of power line that was pretty much vaporized, that was underground. That was an underground power line. So it certainly can penetrate the earth to more than a couple of feet. I'm not going to say, I don't know how far down, but I do know in actual testing, things that were below ground were damaged. Of course, a heavy mass such as a thick concrete wall will help attenuate this energy wave, but not block it. The only thing that's going to truly block it would be like a solid metal type of enclosure, and that's what we call a Faraday cage. And even with things in a Faraday cage, if there's any openings, any place a wire could come in and out of that Faraday cage, or even an open, like a window or a door, that's going to make that Faraday cage much less protective. But I've told folks that trying to protect a specific device, such as a shortwave radio or something like that, it may be more economical to just have a spare and keep it in a metal container. And I have several simple plans and instructions in the book how to do that for such things as like a galvanized trash can. I mean, they're metal type enclosure with a metal lid and tight fitting metal lid. That's the kind of thing that can help block an EMP. It's not 100%, especially not in the extremely high frequency range, but for most of the frequency ranges of an EMP weapon, that is probably about the only thing you can do to really protect it. Although there are some things in the book to describe filtering, ferrets and things that you can do to the wire coming into your house that can help mitigate or attenuate the high voltage surge on your power wiring. But still, your electronic type devices can still be damaged, and it may be more economical to just have a spare of anything that you consider to be critical, that you must maintain operation.
It's interesting you mentioned the Faraday cage. Every microwave that is made has a black grid between the glass and the so when you open the door, there's always a black looks like a metal insert or as decorated as can, but that is a Faraday cage that keeps the microwave contained inside of the microwave oven and keeps it from coming out of the microwave oven. So people are actually much more familiar with the concept of a Faraday cage than they realize, because every household has one. It's in your microwave oven. It's built into it.
Exactly right.
So it's kind of something that we can wrap our minds around, because it's an everyday device. It's not something that you have to be an electrical engineer to understand. What's interesting is that to make this really contemporary, is that Donald Trump has issued an executive order to prepare for an EMP attack. This was released back in March 29th of 2019, that this was signed as an executive order, and their analysis was that, and it was a pretty thorough article, is should we be concerned about EMPs? And their conclusion was it was unlikely that an EMP, but with these rogue regimes, it's not the organized regimes, it's these rogue regimes that want to make a point, that want to do something that's going to bring them great notoriety that they can lay claim to. That's where the Al-Qaeda's and the various organizations, terror organizations, take their greatest pride, of course, is in doing something like a 9/11. And so this would be something falling into the wrong hands. The assessment that they made was that a more likely attack might be through a high-powered microwave device, and that would only have a shortened range. So when we take a look at this idea of EMP, which has been discussed for many years, as you studied it, what is the likelihood of an EMP being deployed by an enemy? We look at ourselves basically as the center of the universe, that everything is pointed towards America. Obviously, we have the power to deploy EMPs ourselves against other areas. Europe is about the same size as the United States, so we could take out Europe and European communications. The after effect, how could you recover from that? I mean, if your whole electrical grid is taken out, if all your communication systems, cellular, landline communications, me protecting a radio in a galvanized container, so I've protected that radio. What and who would it connect with if the communication systems were brought down?
Well, these are all good points, and I want to mention also, earlier I said that the solar storms were almost identical to the effects of the E3 part of an EMP pulse. And solar storms occur on an 11-year cycle. So anytime we have a lot of sunspots on the sun, which is every 11 years, these sunspots are constantly giving off these large discharges of energy that go out in space. You might think of a water hose shooting out, and they're directional. And of course, it can go in any direction, but the odds are very high that it's going to cross the Earth's path when this happens. And statistically, it's 12% of this happening of each one of these 11-year cycles. So, even if somebody says, well, an EMP is it's not possible that some country is going to do this, the protection to the grid is the same. So if somebody would protect the grid for EMP, they'd also be protecting the grid from a solar storm. And the sun has done this before. Back in 1859, the only electronics or electrical systems in the world was the telegraph system. But we had thousands of miles of telegraph wire across the United States, crossing Europe, and this happened in 1959, and the coronal mass ejection, or this sun discharge, it totally destroyed the telegraph systems. It set telegraph offices on fire. It shocked operators. So even if you say for a minute, well, okay, I'm not too worried about an EMP, you have to protect our grid, and nobody's doing that. And the protection for the EMP is identical. If you did these protections, you would also be protecting against the solar storm effects. And we have over 2,000 high voltage transformers in the United States, very high voltage transformers. These things are big as a house, and there's no spares. And it takes about 2 years to design, build them, ship them, and install them. And the United States total manufacturing is only meets 15% a year of our normal needs from expansion. So if we suddenly had a couple hundred of these transformers melted down from an EMP or a solar storm, that's the problem. It could take years to get the grid back up again, not from wires melting, but from the transformers melting or being damaged. And all the production in the world of transformers is 100 a year. If you take every manufacturer in the world, and all of ours right now are coming from South Korea. So we don't make them here in this country. And the thought of trying to replace several hundred of these, it's not feasible that we could do that. I mean, you can't even transfer one down the street without taking down the power lines, the phone lines. I mean, these things, some of them are, 20, 30 feet tall and wide, and they take trailers with hundreds of tires and axles on them just to move them. So that's where my concern is. Whether it's an EMP or a solar storm, if we don't start protecting the grid and protecting these transformers, if it happens, it's years to repair, not a couple of weeks. It's not going to be a power outage that lasts weeks.
Jeff, as you assess the world, and we just have about a minute left, relatively speaking to other major nations across the world, they're obviously facing the same infrastructure, the same grid, the same kind of challenges that we have here in America. And in other cases, they're even much less developed. Is this a kind of a universal exposure? We're all exposed to solar flares. We're all exposed to the possibility of there being an electromagnetic event, whether or not it be natural or man-made, and that all of our grids across all the nations across the world are really in a fairly deplorable state of readiness for response to this kind of attack.
I guess the answer would be, who do we consider a target? And that target would be a country that's more dependent on the electronics and the communications and the banking and internet communications, phone lines. I mean, look at a satellite view of North Korea at nighttime. It's almost dark.
Right.
United States is lit up like a Christmas tree. So the target is going to be any country that's very sophisticated in their infrastructure and electronics, and they're going to be the ones hurt the worst. And that's why I have expressed my concern for this.
Well, I very much appreciate it. That's why I had you back on, because you talk about things that that we're not talking about, that we need to realize that there are these both natural and man-made areas of impact that could bring us to a very grave crossroads, and that as we think about elected officials, as we think about local infrastructure agenda, our relationship with our power companies, maybe America needs to lend a little bit more of a voice to making sure that our grid is protected. You and I talked about this on the last time we were on together. I can drive by almost any substation. It is completely unprotected except by a chain link fence. And the way the substations work is if I take one out, the load's shifted to the next substation, but it's not equipped to handle the loads, so it goes down, and it has a cascading effect because of the way it's been developed. And you don't have armament, you don't have people protecting. You can drive down country roads and you see these substations, and they're just sitting out there wide out in the open, and maybe this is an area, because of the age of electronics, we need to take it a little bit more seriously, and I appreciate you doing the legwork to educate us on that. Again, the book is called The ABCs of EMP, A Practical Guide to Both Understanding and Surviving an EMP by Jeffrey Yago. You can visit ignitinganation.com, look at today's broadcast schedule. You'll see this book listed. Click on it and get a copy for yourself. You don't have to be an electronic academic to read it. It is concise, it's clear, and it's something that needs to be thought about, especially as we become more distance learning, more electronic dependent. We also become that much more exposed because our technology is advancing at a faster rate than our infrastructure can support it. And if you impact the infrastructure, then you impact our ability to operate as a society. Jeffrey Yago, thank you for doing this, and thank you for sharing it with us here on Revealing the Truth.
Thank you too.
God bless you, my friend. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.